welcome to the Retro Adventurers, a podcast about classic text adventures. I'm Dave Hawkins. I'm joined by my regular host, Jason Compton. Hello, Jason.
Hello, are you feeling super today, Dave?
I'm feeling slightly less than super, but I'm here in body and mind. So let's hope this is okay.
Well,
I've actually had flu for the last couple of weeks. I can pinpoint when I got it. I was sitting on a bus next to a lovely woman who spent the entire journey coughing 2 weeks ago.
that's a more prosaic explanation that you've simply been using too many of your superpowers and you need to recharge out, in your normal form.
I like the connection you're making there. Just for all of our listeners, this is a superhero special edition where we cover two superhero games and a little surprise bonus at the end of it. Okay, so let's move on to our appetizer, Redhawk. This is a game published by Melbourne House, which was the home of The Hobbit. This was published a few years later in 1986 and was developed by a company called Silhouette Software. It's a little unusual as text adventures go, and it's certainly a departure from The Hobbit. Jason, could you tell me what you played this on, first of all?
Yeah, I played the Commodore 64 version. I played the original TAP file of it. There was apparently a disc release because there's documentation for that, but that one's not preserved. What there is out there, there's a pirated version that has an intro, and there's the original TAP files, and that gets you the demo as well. So I played the playable demo. We could talk about just how interactive it truly is, but that demo gives you the prequel. It gives you the run up to the events that kick in when you actually start playing Redhawk proper. So I played C64 version, which gave me both the demo and the full game.
Yes, yeah, I did notice that online actually when I'm doing some research that there was a demo version. I haven't played it, so I'll be interested in your comments on that. And I think one of the things that we really sort of need to say about Redhawk is it's probably one of the games that truly tries to actually capture the feel of a comic, isn't it? I mean, you've got little panels moving across the top. They describe your actions. When you interact with other people, you watch the little text bubbles come up in their mouths and things like that, and the text scrolls across.
Yep, 3 comic panels up there.
3 comic panels at the top, yeah.
Yeah, so it is a graphic adventure, which we've definitely done, but in a style that definitely is a big departure and isn't mirrored in other comic book adventures. So this one, by time you get to 1986, you're already seeing a lot of text adventure creators are playing with the format. How can we add graphics? What would it mean to add graphics? Does that mean that we can change the way that we're presenting the game? And even though Redhawk ends up being a bit of a dead end, what an interesting way to structure the interface.
It certainly was, and I mean, I think as a game that was intended to reflect comic books, I mean, they certainly did do a good job on it. Because it's sort of a fairly strange mix between your comic book and the actual text inputs. If you look at the actual game itself, I mean, the parser had a similar quality to The Hobbit, but I didn't generally find that was sort of overly used. I'm sort of trying to sum it up because when I was actually starting to play this, I was a bit lost, really.
Yeah.
I was expecting perhaps less of a text adventure and more of a sort of like an interactive, not necessarily interactive fiction, but perhaps more sort of point and click, because you've got your commands down the bottom, haven't you, that you use, but those are actually accessed by function keys. And they're just little shortcuts, aren't they, to the most commonly used words.
Well, yeah, as I remember when I pitched you this game as the companion to Spider-Man, you were, it took some convincing, let's put it that way, because you were like, this looks like a GUI. And I said, no, these are just shortcuts. It's a parser adventure. It's actually, we can argue about how useful those shortcuts are. They at least remind you kind of what the key items are of interest in the game are going to be. But no, this is it's straight text input. However, apart from the comic panel, there's no scroll back. There's instead scrolling side to side. This is a real time game. And not like some that we've seen where there are certain real-time inputs. This is a real-time clock running all the time, and travel throughout the city where you are the superhero. We don't know if you're the only superhero. We should talk a little bit about just who Redhawk is. Redhawk versus Kevin Oliver and what he's doing in this world.
I mean, obviously, Kevin Oliver here, if you're reading through the manual, he is Redhawk, and he can turn into Redhawk by using the word quaff, which is basically hawk backwards, or KWAH, I would say, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah,
KWAH.
I would go KWAH. Although you,
KWAH.
as Dave Hawkins, probably are hiding a secret identity behind that somewhere.
You're not the first person to say that. um, Yeah, I mean, so you play Kevin Oliver, and one of the quite interesting things is there are certain things that you can do in the game as Kevin Oliver, and certain things you can do as Red Hawk, and actually swapping between the two personas is quite a vital part of the game. Your sort of secret identity enables you to take jobs. Kevin Oliver is almost a sort of Peter Parker character, isn't
Yes.
he?
Yeah.
He's a photographer. You can earn money by taking photos and selling them to a newspaper. And then you've got the Red Hawk character whose job at the end of the day is to save the world. But I quite like that you do get supervillains, and we'll come on to that a bit later. But you also get real-time muggings, and they happen randomly, but at set times. You could be, for example, in the park or on one of the stations, and a mugger may appear, but they'll always appear at the same time, just not necessarily in the same location, which I thought was quite an interesting twist to the whole genre.
Yeah, and full credit, at least for my partial playthrough, to the recently posted solution on Casa, because it does lay out the timetable and whether the mugger will always show up in the same place or whether it's going to be one of a few random locations. But yes, as Kevin Oliver, we need to document crimes in order to earn money to take trains and taxis and so forth. But as Red Hawk, we need to stop the evildoers and bring them to justice.
Exactly. So let's talk about your first experiences with it, and then how you sort of progressed. I mean, obviously, it sounds like you haven't finished it from having to go through Casa, or
Yeah, and I'll talk about where I just made a mistake and then ran out of time and wasn't able to get through the full game. But the prequel, the demo, shows the events that are taking place before the game starts, in which you see switching between the Kevin Oliver and Red Hawk personas to hit some baddies and try to take items off them because they are trying to set up a bomb to destroy the city, as you do. And what that prequel helps establish, which you're also reminded of very quickly in the game, is that being Red Hawk is very draining on Kevin Oliver. So you have to really be careful when you turn into Red Hawk, how much you fly around. Flying is free, but it does deplete your energy, because this is not just a real-time text input game, but it is a game with, you could say, RPG-light elements in that you have a health meter and you have a popularity bar. So the prequel shows us that the health meter depletes very quickly when you're out there tussling as Kevin Oliver. Then, because you've run out of Red Hawk power, the baddies beat you up and put you in the hospital, where the game then begins. And the documentation for this game is reasonably detailed. It does give you sense for how you're going to need to move around the world. But the fact that this is an adventure that's going to take place in a single 24-hour day, but not even 24 hours. There's something like 9 or 10 hours of all the key elements of the game. So you need to your first playthrough, if you're just coming at this naively, will be one of wandering around, not being able to get to muggings in time, running out of money, and so forth.
oh, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting you were saying about the health bar, and again, and that kind of connection between things. It wasn't overly clear for me in my first read through to the actual documentation. So I was sort of staring at the screen a bit, thinking, well, what's that mean there? Why is that bar there? And then, as you say, it occurred to me, and as I read through the documentation a second time, it became a little more apparent. I did struggle with a few things with this. The first thing, I mean, because of the nature of the actual comic strips, there was no indication of where you could leave any single location, and it was a real trial and error. Can I go east? Can I go north? Can I, etc., etc. I mean, I actually found that quite frustrating. I mean, did you get on with that, or?
No, you're right. One of the consequences of the interface is that descriptions are very terse. It is a small world, which there is a published map of. So, and you could spend time mapping it, but you're right. It is not a place that is, nothing is really described with exits and entrances, because in comic book fashion. They're trying to fit as much of the descriptive text into, one or two lines at the top and or bottom of a comic book panel. Similarly, that spoken text which scrolls by, shades of School Days for those who remember that game.
Yes, very much.
Yeah, that's not information that you can get back. The manual does talk about a way to like hold down a key and both pause the clock and get a replay on spoken text. That wasn't something that I was able to make work. And frankly, because I was playing on an emulator, I just used the Vice pause to hold things up if I needed to think about it or slow down the text I was reading or whatever. Not that it scrolls by particularly quickly, but one of the trade-offs, although the interface isn't there's not a lot of wasted space as we would see in some GUI attempts into the 80s and 90s. So it's not wasted space in that way, but just the design aesthetic means that there's not really much in the way of scrollback, not much in the way of descriptive text. And so you're right, navigating the admittedly small map does require a lot of trial and error. And because this is a game with interruptive events, for example, once you get a radio, you'll get police alerts about a mugging over that radio. There are, muggers can show up where you are, or other events can go off. And it did feel like at times the cached commands, because you can enter multiple commands in a row and they'll play out slowly. But I did run into on more than a few occasions where one of those commands would get lost, and sometimes that was me saying KWAH to either turn into Redhawk or turn back to Kevin to preserve energy. And it seemed like those got glitched out because an interruptive event had occurred.
Yes, I mean, I actually didn't bother using the more advanced features of the parser. I mean, generally, although it was pretty sophisticated, I found that using just the standard sort of, well, the four words, such as put the something in the box and things like that, were more than sufficient to actually play the game. But you did actually, on quite a few occasions, need to use the full four words to actually solve puzzles, which, unlike sort of some of the things like Scott Adams, which went on to use more sophisticated parsers, and indeed The Hobbit, this is one of the few games where actually four words really were quite important.
Yeah, for example, when you stop one of the big baddies, because you're basically trying to get these four key cards to disarm the bomb. So when you're facing a sort of named enemy, not just a mugger, you have to subdue them, then examine them, and that was an interesting quirk of the world too. The game explicitly considers examine to be a body search because like when you're just starting out and meeting seemingly normal people, like they resist your search, and I'm like, oh, I thought I was just looking them over. But yes, so you subdue a baddie, you examine them, and it tells you what key card they have on them, and then you need to take blue key card from the named baddie. It's not enough to just take it, and because the clock is ticking, you really do need to optimize your path through this game. Which as we're wrapping up, I'll talk about what oddly game it most resembles.
It'll be quite interesting to hear that. I mean, we had some traditional supervillains, didn't we? And we had Fuser, Techno, the Rat, and Merlin. These are the villains you actually have to defeat to get the key cards to disarm the bomb. I quite liked that little bit. I thought it was very comic-y.
Yep.
I just think overall, I mean, I found this a very interesting take on the text adventure genre. But because of the little bits, the navigation complications, the needing to get the commands, as we've just covered, exactly right, whilst you're against the clock, I found that irritating. I'm going to say now, it seemed a little too harsh. Maybe it would have been good if the clock could have paused for a moment whilst you're carrying out a few actions and then gone back into the real world. But I don't know. I'm in several minds about this game, and I'm not overly sure that most of those are 100% positive.
Well, so my take on it is I really thought it was a cool format. It is a little sluggish, but that said, like the way that it's drawing the comic panels in a single load. Again, this is a memory resident game on
It
all of these
is.
platforms. So they're doing a lot with a little. They've got comic book humor in that you are obviously a relatively low rent, low renown kind of superhero in that everybody's calling you Red Duck, Red Horse, et cetera, et cetera, which seems very on brand for kind of mainstream comics of the 80s.
Mm.
And that was something that I thought of as we were playing this. We have been living in the 21st century in which comics are, they're kind of the mass media right now. In the 80s, they were not nearly so cool. Comic book derived media was, largely confined to cartoons and things like that. It was not the mega billion-dollar business that it is today. So I think maybe it didn't find the kind of audience that it might have found in another time, simply because comics didn't have quite the same mainstream appeal. For me, yes, I thought that there was just a little too much going on. I thought that the real time system was unnecessarily punishing. And what I walked away from wishing that this game could have been was something that would have been less text adventure and more, for lack of a better term, like elite/frontier. Like if you gave me this world and gave me procedurally generated missions to do, that maybe the timer was more about move count or time passing. It takes 5 minutes to take a taxi but 15 minutes to take a train, or whatever. I would have enjoyed just kind of aimlessly, grinding away to earn money and reputation points and stuff like that in a procedurally generated world full of these different quests. And I think that could have fit in the space of what they were trying to do. Instead, we get something that at the end of the day is an optimization game, basically like Infocom's Suspended, in which there's this crisis facing the world, and there's going to be additional crises that pop up over the course of the game, and you, the player, ultimately need to figure out how to optimize your course through the game to get the best outcome. Um,
Yes.
which was odd that was the direction that it took, feeling that much like Suspended. I got stuck on the rat because I missed a step, and like I said, I was leaning heavily on the walkthrough at that point. I did not pick up the cat, so I'd had 2 key cards already, but when I got to the rat, I didn't have the cat, and honestly, I just ran out of time before we had to record this episode. So didn't see the ending. What I also didn't see, and I dug around in the game in memory a little bit, didn't find. You've got that popularity meter, which goes up when we apprehend criminals, goes down when we miss a mugging. Does the game end if your popularity drops too low, or is it something that like at the end of the game that's a thing to optimize, not just your time through it, but if you can maximize your reputation score, that's kind of a further way to optimize the game?
It's an interesting question, actually. I mean, it never ended for me, but it's funny you should say that, because when you're reading the documentation, it clearly states that you can choose to play Redhawk as a hero or a villain. I couldn't see any way at all you could play it as a villain. You just become less popular by being, well, just not being a superhero.
Yeah, that didn't quite resonate for me either. Like I guess they were saying that you could ignore the crimes, but yeah, that feels like the documentation writer trying to spice it up a little bit. But it does seem like, much like how your gameplay of Suspended, you can optimize it on how few casualties, how quickly you repair all the systems on the planet. Then in this case, yeah, maximizing that reputation score would be a way to do it. Like one thing I noted was that the walkthrough, I presume to cut down on time, it doesn't have you actually arresting the main baddies. You just subdue them and then go ahead and move on to the next thing. But I was like, all right, what happens if I arrest them? And it seemed like I got a nice popularity boost from that. So there's probably still undiscovered secrets about this game, since it seems like it's not been given as much attention as some other titles from the 80s.
I think that's probably true, and I mean, I think there's probably quite a lot of sort of an undercurrent that is easily missed. So it is possible that on playthroughs again you could discover more about it. I'm just not sure from my about the 4 times that I actually did play it to try to get through. I'm not sure I'd actually have the energy or the enthusiasm to go back and try to discover that underbelly.
Yeah, I think there's more to explore here. Like I liked the mechanism that being Redhawk, depleted your energy quickly, which both gave an in-world explanation for why you can't just fly around and solve problems easily, but also it kind of framed, well, what would it be to be a superhero? There's lots of Marvel and DC explorations of the burdens and so forth. But what if it was just really hard? What if it was just really debilitating? I was actually reminded, not that anybody's ever asked, but the easy way to fix some of the dumber dumber mistakes they created for themselves in something like Star Trek: The Next Generation, in having a character of Counselor Troy who can read everybody's mind. What if that was really hard? What if, reading one person's mind put you in a coma for 4 weeks? It's like, do we really need this answer today? Because if you do, I'll get it for you, but you won't see me for the next month. So being Redhawk is tough. He can't be everywhere. He can't, he's not even all powerful when he is Redhawk. Muggers can dish out damage to you while you're trying to apprehend them. So I liked it. It was interesting. We know there is at least one more game in the series. There's the game KWAH. We'll see if we get to it. But as ways of playing with the text adventure format go, the graphic adventure format in particular, I thought this was, although not a hit, one of the better ways to expand and stretch the concept.
I'd agree with you there. It certainly is a fresh approach to text adventures. It was interesting, and it just didn't quite grip me, and it's annoying really, because I'm a huge text adventure fan. I'm a huge superhero fan, and I just wish I'd enjoyed it more.
I have a note here. If you revert to Kevin while you're trying to hit and arrest a mugger, which happens quite a bit, because again, being Redhawk is tough. Kevin, the message is, Kevin's too puny for this. He looks a bit dead. Game over.
That did not happen to me actually, but I did spend a lot of time flipping backwards and forwards and trying to be Kevin more often than not. And in fact, actually, I have made a note here that I actually enjoyed wandering around as Kevin in quite a lot more than being Redhawk. But maybe it's just me. I'm just not superhero type.
Well, I'm happy that we had the chance to play it, and I think it's worth a look. Going in knowing that the real-time system is going to be extremely challenging, but as ways to mix in these RPG light elements, definitely a different take on a graphic adventure. I think Redhawk is worth a look.
Okay, well, my opinion is that I probably wouldn't give it another look. So this may be the first time you actually had a conflicting point of view. So half recommended by us, rather than fully or completely rejected. Okay. Next, we will be looking at Spider-Man, which was the second part of the Scott Adams Questprobe series, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. Okay, well, as I've mentioned, the second game we're going to be talking about today is Spider-Man, part of the Questprobe series. I haven't played this on the ZX Spectrum emulator, but as it's an Adventure International game, it was available on pretty much every platform that ever existed. So, Jason, what did you play it on?
Yeah, I played the Commodore 64 version, and I'm going to make the point to say I played the disc version because there is, much like The Hobbit, there is both a disc load and a single tape load variant of it, which I did not realize going into it. But yeah, in addition, we could have chosen the Atari 8-bit, the BBC Micro, the Electron, Commodore 16 and Plus 4, Apple II, DOS, Atari ST. Like they blanketed the world with this one.
Oh, they really did. Yeah, you've forgotten the Texas.
Was it on TI as well?
Oh, yes, man. On TI as well. Yeah.
So yeah, and part of that reason is that although this is, they've rebranded the Questprobe series, we've got bitmap graphics available on the disc versions. They're more the vector drawn and filled versions.
There's a BBC version as well. I've got down here.
Yep, yeah, I mentioned that one.
Oh, did you? Right.
But under the hood, this is still the Scott Adams database system that he created in order to do Adventureland, published in the form of Pirate Adventure in Byte Magazine, as we've covered on a recent issue. Like, this is at its core still using the underpinnings that Scott Adams created several years before.
Mm. Right, let's summarize the game. But I mean, what you've essentially got to do, you play Spider-Man, and you have to collect a collection of gems to solve the game. So in many ways, it's very much like Adventureland or even the classic adventure. You simply have to solve puzzles to collect treasures to complete the game. So in many ways, it's a very traditionalist plot.
It is. And unlike some other games like Adventureland, where at least you're collecting up a lot of different treasures, in this one, you're just collecting 18 gems.
You are. Yes.
And taking back to the Chief Examiner, which I keep forgetting, is this a Marvel concept or is that a Scott Adams conceit? Because that one didn't get a trademark note, I don't think.
No, it's a Scott Adams creation. I've actually spoken to Scott about this, but I realised it quite a while ago, actually, before I really knew Scott that well. But no, it was a character that was created just for the Questprobe series. So anyone who wants to Google it, you won't find him on the Marvels list.
Okay, he is in Marvel fandom, but yes, I think it does mention that Scott Adams is the origin point.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's interesting you said about the being a disc version, because one of the things that immediately stood out for me for a Spectrum game is that not only is every location represented by a graphic, which is, as we've discussed before, incredibly unusual. In fact, this may be the only one that I'm aware of, unless, of course, the Hulk and the Human Torch and the Thing game did something similar. But not only do you get a graphic of every location, but your actions affect the actual images itself. So you see the changes on screen. And I'm not aware of any other Spectrum game that did that. So it's very much in line with most of the US games, which you're very used to playing and you were brought up playing. And exact one that Ben and I have mentioned in the past and said, oh, yeah, no, we don't see those things like that. Things don't change. You just have a few graphics thrown in here and there. So, I mean, that actually really stood out for me at the beginning. I mean, is the Commodore version the same?
It does not do the bitmap item in every single room. So, for example, there are some rooms where you can pick things up and they will disappear, but that does not then get overlaid when you drop it later necessarily. One thing that I noted as a difference, I believe, the Commodore 64 disc version does flip the graphic when you climb on the ceiling, which I thought was really clever. It looked to me, I did take a look at a Spectrum long play. Looks like the Spectrum version did not do that. Do you remember that happening?
Do that.
Yeah,
no, it doesn't do that.
That was a really cool touch. Yeah, it didn't do it. I did take a look at the 64 tape load version. I don't think it did that one either. But
no.
It doesn't animate things like opening the elevator doors like you see. And that's the thing I want to talk about with the graphics is the way the perspective changes. But for example, on the disc load version, when you pry open the elevator doors using your Spidey strength, you see Spider-Man doing it. But it's inconsistent about whether it's a first person or a third person view, which I thought was kind of odd.
To me, this actually captured more maybe the comic book feel that the actual graphics themselves, rather than being first person, third person, were to sort of tell the narrative rather than from the player's point of view.
You're right. I guess that is a trope that comic books can avail themselves of. They can show you the heroes or even the villain's point of view and then switch to third person. So I guess in that sense, I shouldn't have been surprised. One thing I wanted to add is that the bitmap graphics on the C64 version, sadly, are very obviously the Apple II graphics with the Apple II color choice, which is unfortunate. So in a way, the 64 tape version, although the graphics were more primitive because they were vectors and kind of crude shapes, at least they didn't have that. Maybe they had their Spectrum origins, but they didn't feel quite so obviously hastily ported over from the Apple II.
Oh, to be honest, I was actually quite impressed with the graphics, not just from the way you could interact with them. They were fairly high quality for a Spectrum game, and they were fast. I
Yes.
mean, they appeared instantly, which I'm guessing they were literally images stored in memory and then they were just flipped over. But this is at the time when we were looking at games where they'd be flood filled to create your backgrounds, and you'd have dithering and things like that that were fillings. And I was actually quite impressed with the amount that they managed to fit into what was just under 48K. So I mean that's a very positive thing. I should also point out that a lot of the graphics are reused. I mean, were they reused in the Commodore version? I mean, you've got the lift shaft, for example, and there are 3 locations in the lift shaft, and it's exactly the same image in each one.
Yeah, that's meant to be amazing. Yeah, they spend a lot of time looking at the lift shaft, a lot of time looking at the fan. But other than that, the graphics are unique. But yeah, things that are supposed to be, maze-like, like going through the lift, which, interestingly enough, like there are different versions of the game out there, in part because this is from the time when Adventure International was no longer publishing all of its own games. So these were released by Green Valley Publishing, for example, in the US. So different versions have some hints included in them. And for example, one of the hints is just to get to the basement, go down 5 times after entering the fan. So obviously people were like, what is going on in this maze? We don't know where we're going. So it started to come out with a little leaflet saying, yeah, just go down 5 times.
Yes, you funny you say that because I was looking online for the original manual that came with the game, and I came across a manual I'd never seen before, and it said hints to get the biogem, shoot your web at it.
Yep. Yep.
I thought, well, that's just telling you what to do, isn't it? I mean, that's not a hint.
Yeah. Yeah, but obviously, enough feedback had come in that the game was a little obtuse, which I don't think is necessarily. I don't think the puzzles are particularly more sideways than some other Scott Adams games. But yeah, there's some puzzle density and some. Wait, okay, what are we doing? Okay, we're doing this. All right, fine.
I mean, I didn't overly find the game that challenging. I went to Casa, I think, for about 2 or 3 puzzles, but unlike some of the Adventure International games where I've been completely and utterly stumped, usually because of either vocabulary issues or the puzzles are quite US orientated sometimes in some of the games, and they are referring to things that I have no knowledge of as a European.
Mm.
Which I have struggled a bit with some of the AI games. But this, to me, maybe because I have a good knowledge of superheroes, most of it seemed very consistent and very logical. I mean, it sounds like to you were more lost.
Well, what I will say is that it did require some, and I would say good use of superhero powers, but it was not immediately obvious to me that you would do things like just picking up the desk, picking up the couch, which
Yeah.
which they kind of, it's implied like, okay, he's got spider strength. Like, well, sure, but these are bulky things to lug around. Like you're literally picking up, large pieces of furniture and people because there's a defeating the weight trigger puzzle, which involves basically just picking up every heavy item in the game and dropping it there.
Yes.
Which when you don't realize at first that you're going to actually just be picking up a bunch of baddies, which I also wanted to remark on. Like I remember when the first X-Men movie came out, one of the things I walked away from was saying like, man, I'm sure they're trying to save things from sequels, but these are like all C-list villains. Well, this game, it empties the bag right away.
Oh, it does. I have made a note of that. I mean, everything in here. These are pretty much every single one of Spider-Man's major villains.
Yeah, so much so that like Doc Ock isn't even the only villain in a room. Like
Yes.
he's just a throw-in. So that was a little surprising. I guess
I quite like
being
that.
more accustomed to the way that they kind of titrate things out these days.
I mean, the other thing that I liked about the game is the way that it kind of affected the comics in that the puzzles were a mix of puzzles that only Spider-Man could solve because of his superpowers, but it also required Peter Parker's scientific knowledge. I
Hmm.
mean, there's one puzzle that quite literally is a chemical formula,
Yep.
and that's your clue. I mean, I particularly liked that, and I thought it was quite an interesting take that without you swapping between the characters, you were using the different skill sets that these characters have.
Yeah, and it is always nice when games give us some real world knowledge and ability to flex some real world skills or pick something up that might come in handy later in life. And so yeah, the real world chemistry puzzle was a nice touch.
Hmm. We should have mentioned this kind of at the beginning, but this game, like the others, actually came with a comic, which I eventually found online. I used to own it, but I'd forgotten how much the comic is. Not only does it just reading through the story give you clues about the game, it's a full-on comic. It's
Mm.
got adverts in it in the places, and it's exactly the same adverts you'd have, in a comic. And you've got this. I think it's 32 pages. You can read it as a comic. You can read it as a game manual. And I found that a really nice touch. I think it was quite a nice touch in the other games, but I felt this one kind of stood out.
Yeah, and we had talked a little bit with Scott when he has been on the show earlier about the fact that DC Comics was doing this first because they had joint ownership with Atari at the time. Yeah, the '80s were a time to get these video game tie-in licenses that were their own standalone stories, Atari Force and so forth, but
Exactly.
also part of the comic world.
Did you get a chance to look at the manual for the Commodore version? I mean, I found the manual itself for the Spectrum version. It had a few inconsistencies with it. I mean, to start with, one of the commands it actually mentions when describing how complicated the parser is you can say go all the way north or go all the way up. You can't. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I only found very, very terse manuals. So no, that's interesting that there were more elaborate ones. Because like I was saying, at least the US versions were not published by Adventure International, and I think they were just kind of shoveled out with whatever would fit in a fairly small insert. But
Mm.
no, that's interesting too that they're promising things that the game definitely doesn't do because this is pretty much a two-word kind of experience. So
It really is. No, I mean, the actual manual itself made quite a big deal of how advanced the parser was,
meh.
and you really didn't need to do that. I mean, whether that's because there are other versions out there that actually do have those features, maybe the Atari version does or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think so. So I think that may
No,
have just been some miscommunication.
it could well have been. Okay, I'm going to say I genuinely enjoyed this one, and it made me feel more like a superhero than Red Hawk did. What's your take on it then?
I kind of walked away with the opposite feeling. The tone of my voice, as I said, and the quest here is to collect 18 gems.
Yes.
Although yes, you're right. Visually and with some of the puzzle solving, we are doing things that Spider-Man slash Peter Parker would do. And I think the depth of it can be applauded for that. But it's just oddly dropped into this and not just Scott Adams mindset, but Adventureland mindset but at the end of the day, it's just about getting these treasures together, dropping them in a room, and saying score. And that felt very anticlimactic. It felt very not in the spirit of the other things that we were doing. Rather than having an objective to reach and kind of be applauded for, instead it was just gathering up gems. So I found that as it was reaching that end game, rather than building to the crescendo of the big heroic act, like Redhawk, disarming the bomb and saving the
Mm.
day, instead the climactic act being hitting score, like you're a treasure collecting adventure, which you are. So I found that my interest in it was waning, and my interest in immersion in it was waning as I got deeper, which was not what I was hoping for.
Interesting setup because whilst this is definitely a just collect all the treasures, the end, whilst maybe it could have been more climactic, that didn't bother me because I actually felt that I was taking part in a proper Spider-Man story, and it was the story that, for me, that was the engrossing part. I mean, yeah, it would have been great if you'd had this big standoff, but it might have been kind of difficult as you've already beaten virtually every villain that Spider-Man ever fought
Sure.
during the game.
Yeah, even like getting to the place, rather than the score thing. I think that would have, you finally make it out and you're applauded or whatever. That just yeah, it left me a little cold.
Okay. Well, again, this is now the second time we've got a recommendation from me and a. Well, would you recommend people try it out?
As hmm, I guess I would say that if you're not playing through the Scott Adams games in order, it's a perfectly reasonable one to play. I think if you've been through a lot of the earlier series, getting to this point, yeah, because we're in the mid 80s at this point, getting to this point, I was hoping for some more growth and a little more tie-in for that. So I would say if you're not going through an order, yeah, have a look. Obviously, if you're willing to gobble up as much Spider-Man media as there is, definitely check it out. But I would say we've played better games. Even this episode, is my take, let alone for the rest of the series.
Okay. Okay, well, that's interesting. Well, I think then we'll leave it up to our listeners to decide whether they want to play it. And there's plenty of information online if you want to read more about it. And I think we'll certainly post some links. I particularly want to post a link to the comic, which I think we'll add at the end of it, which I found on the Internet Archive, and I think that's certainly worth a read. It's if you're a comic book fan, it's worth a read, and it's worth an historic read as well. Okay, well, thank you, Jason, for your feedback there. And, again, we'll leave it to our listeners to decide. Okay, well, let's move on to our bonus game, or shall we call it the game that never was? Firstly, I've got to say many thanks to Scott Adams for supplying us with this and giving us an opportunity. We're going to talk a little bit about Questprobe 4, the unreleased X-Man game. Obviously, you know, Jason, that we both played this on DOS because that was the only version available.
Right. Yeah. Scott was kind enough to supply us with the development version out there. It's been documented on some other sites, and we'll include links to that in the show notes. But I had a little bit of a struggle just finding a version of DOSBox that liked it. I was using some fancier alpha version, and I was getting device not found errors at first. So I had to go back to regular radial DOSBox and run it. But what I did note with some intrigue is that this is still, again, it's the same basic Scott Adams database format from 1978. There's some sort of specialized commands that you can see in his comments because you can see his commented code where he's saying like this is the specialized handling for Magneto ordering people around and so forth. But still using essentially that same old system. And of course,
it is.
Yeah, and I've tipped off one of the things that would have made this game unusual. There were people still, starting to experiment with morally gray characters or the baddies or whatever. But the main protagonist in Questprobe 4 X-Men, at least such that it exists, was Magneto, who is kind of the main antagonist from the mutant side of things in X-Men.
Is although in the comics he eventually becomes the leader of the X-Men, so who knows where we were at the point this was. I mean, this would have, had it been released, probably would have been about 87, 88, I would guess, from the other games.
I think we're a little earlier than that.
A little earlier than that.
Yeah.
I mean, in many ways, I mean, I find it surprising that the games ended so quickly because, I mean, the text adventure industry still had a good 3 or 4 years in it after this. So it's kind of surprising, isn't it, that it dropped off? Maybe was it really dropping off in the US by this point?
Well, you were definitely seeing some dips. Infocom was having financial struggles, which eventually led it to being acquired by Activision. There's ways to argue about how much of that had to do with their non-text adventure pursuit, the database cornerstone. But the fact is, that yes, you were seeing it was starting to become less of the norm to do text or even text graphics adventures by that point. Games like Electronic Arts releasing Amnesia as a pure text game in the second half of the 80s. That was an outlier rather than the norm.
Right.
We've already talked about when we did the Dark Crystal. Sierra left that market behind in 1983 and never looked back. So I can see where things were dipping a bit. And I believe when he's been on the show, Scott has alluded to the fact that some of the arrangements that he had made, particularly with Commodore, led to financial struggles for Adventure International as well. So
They did.
I think between some of the marketability of these games dipping, the fact that, like we were talking about with Spider-Man, comics were not the slam dunk license property that they would become later on. That I can see where somebody would say, the money's not here. I'm going to focus my entrepreneurial energies elsewhere because and yeah, we can talk too about whether Scott was really fully exploiting the potential of the comic book genre. Again, Spider-Man kind of becoming a gem collect game. X-Men, I can see in the code. There's a bunch of gems still floating around in this game. So there may have been that he was not lighting the imagination of the comic book buying audience on fire, but it just wasn't as pervasive a property back then. So I can see where things tailed off, and it was okay to let it go.
It's interesting. I think possibly because of tools like Professional Adventure Writer and the Quill, that the text adventures lasted a lot longer in Europe and in the UK. So, I mean, that was just sort of an aside, really, because we haven't really talked about the game yet. So, as you say, first experiences of the X-Men, it does appear to be another gem quest mission. Is interesting that you are playing Magneto. From as far as I got, and bearing in mind that this is an incomplete game, so there's probably a lot more information that Scott had intended to include in there. But I will say, probably the only game that I've ever come across that this game chucks you into a maze straight away.
Pretty much, yep. And even getting to the maze was oddly challenging. We didn't talk about the fact that in Spider-Man, I forgot to talk about this note. All of the prompts start with Spider-Man, I want you to. And that was the prompt for every command. It seemed like with these Questprobe games, Scott may have been trying to introduce an audience that he thought wasn't playing text adventures until they got to his Marvel games, into, what does it mean? How am I controlling this character? In X-Men, he makes this weird choice that I don't know. It felt like it was actively thwarting me, who knows how to play adventure games. Just getting out of that room with again that chief examiner character. I'm like, okay, it mentions a doorway. I'll go to the doorway, and it says like, okay, well now you're standing by the doorway, and there's the desk with the chief examiner nearby. I'm like, well, great. I'll go to that doorway. Okay, you're by the doorway. It took me looking at the code to figure. Oh no, I'm sorry. It took me looking at the Adventure Gamer article that we'll link to realize that you have to walk through doorway. Like, why are we doing this? Northeast, southwest. These should be working for me, or go door. So it was weird that he was trying to subvert the expectations of an experienced player. Maybe he thought that was more intuitive for people who were coming at it brand new, but I was very surprised. And then yes, the chief examiner has told you you will have to use all of your Magneto powers to get through this maze, which, had there been documentation, they probably would have hinted a little bit more what those powers would be. We are left to piece together from the code and some other guides out there what those powers might be. One of which is the ability to make light, which definitely helps you navigate through those darker portions of the maze.
It is. I'm not actually. I had to use the same article to work that bit out. I did work out that I could fly. That seemed a fairly common ability for Magneto. I've been wanting to say about the go door and things like that, but I know you could go desk and you'd be standing in front of the desk, and I do wonder whether Scott was trying to add more detail into the way it was approached, because I've always found go door, go cave. That's never felt particularly intuitive to me. I've always felt that go through door, which was the problem you had, and was the exact problem I didn't have, because it seems more natural for me to say go through door.
Yeah, you can just say what I'm trained for, I guess. And if of all the people that are going to be asking me for for more language to express my idea, I don't expect it to be Scott Adams.
No.
And I know that he was, and he made a point when we spoke to him on the show last year of saying with pride that his parser was getting more sophisticated around this time. But that's fine if you're using it for things that benefit from it. This felt more like, wait, how come I'm being forced to express it this way? So that was odd. Yeah, the flying, it's just okay. I'm floating. That's handy to know. Looking through the code is actually really interesting because it does seem like not the graphics. Graphics were never created for this game, but it feels like most of the locations are implemented. You can look through and see all of his documentation for what the different flags and counters are being used for.
Can, yes.
And you can kind of see in process, how he's thinking about probably the finishing touches on the puzzle portions of this game, which do involve ordering around some of your minions, which have some of their own they're gonna have some of their own characteristics. I did find it's interesting seeing some of the raw code in here about like kind of a basic style language of if flag 0, if j equals 1, then print a message and so forth. So seeing behind the curtain of what the Scott Adams development process was like.
No, definitely. I mean, it's difficult to judge this, really, isn't it? I mean, not really here to judge. It's more sort of an
Oh
historical
yeah.
conversation. But it felt to me like, had this been completed, it might have been quite good. It might have actually stood out a little bit more. Obviously, it's got changes. I do see the problem. You are so used to go door, go cave. For you, I can see why you had that problem. But maybe the idea of trying to give rooms themselves more detail. I don't know. I quite like that. I quite like the idea that perhaps being able to approach something to get more information from it.
Yeah, I agree that making the world more realistically lived in that way was intriguing. But then to your point, then the start of the game is a maze.
Yes.
And again, by setting up this concept of the chief examiner, a robot who kind of puts these heroes through their paces, so he justifies it in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I think the ability to order around kind of both X-Men and Magneto's gang, because you can interact with Nightcrawler and Cyclops and have Cyclops blast doors and stuff like that. But then there's also the Toad, as immortalized in the first X-Men movie. Me going like, really, this is the guy that's kicking the ass of most of the X-Men here, the Toad. Um, yeah, I think it definitely could have been something. I think it shows growth, certainly from the first Questprobe game, the Hulk, which was kind of a terse experience. We saw growth in puzzle depth in Spider-Man, and I think in X-Men he's definitely trying to push if not the boundaries of the format, then definitely get more characters involved, not just as objects to be defeated and picked up and dropped like in Spider-Man, but to help solve X-Men level puzzles.
I mean, to be honest, just from the limited amount of playthrough that we were able to do from the game, it felt like he was starting to get into the idea of how he was going to do these games and how they were going to work. And obviously, it's a shame that they didn't continue. I completely understand why, but it just leaves me sort of wondering, maybe if there'd been a little more time and a couple more games, where we'd have gone with this. And it started to make me feel that they were becoming more rounded.
Yeah, and I think that probably created a little bit of an on-ramp for, like you say, the kind of that prosumer or hobbyist market to crop up and do a little bit more with superhero concepts, in the years to come. But unfortunately, the commercial Quest Probe line ended after just those three games.
It did indeed. Well, I think it was lovely to play it. It was really good to have had a look at what might have been. Going to say very special thanks to Scott for giving us the opportunity to try it out. We obviously can't say to anyone, well, please have a look at it because you can't.
Well, we'll see if it sneaks its way out into the wild again. As mentioned in that article, the dev version was out there. Perhaps Scott will let it leak out into the wild again, and
there is a possibility.
Explore this little archaeological find as well.
It is indeed. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jason. If you anything you would like to add?
I hope that soon we'll get into some real gritty realism and leave this comic book kid stuff behind.
Well, okay. Well, unfortunately, I live in this comic book kid world. That's my head.
Play some Border Zone and Witness and real gritty American style.
Serious stuff for serious people.
No, I enjoyed these theme episodes. It was fun looking through different approaches to the comic book concepts and what that looks like on screen. Again, Scott Adams' Spider-Man is, at its core, a traditional split screen. The top 80% or so is the graphic, bottom 20% or so is the text input. Whereas the Redhawk guys, they said, no, we're going to do vertical comic book panels, and we're going to show the results of each of your actions in comic book style. Each of them had their strengths. Each of them had their limitations. Each of them, didn't become a genre-busting success that then spawned another 12 games, as the Questprobe series was originally envisioned to be. But for us, a really fun way to see, okay, where was the commercial market evolving in the mid-late 80s, and where did audiences maybe overlook them unfairly, or what were dead ends for a good reason.
Well, no, I think, to be honest, as I say, the text adventures lasted for a good 4 or 5 years afterwards in Europe, probably for different reasons. I think partly that may have been because we were still relying on memory resident games. And the options, we had less options than you Americans. You were all sitting around there with your Apple IIs and
our lavish disk drives and
yes, Lord, get over us with your technology.
Well,
and you've got to remember, of course, that the internet came to America long before it came to Europe as well, and I think that was starting to change things even in the late 80s.
By the late 80s, I mean, because the UK in particular had such onerous phone rates still at that time.
It did.
In a lot of places in the US, at least for local phone calls, you could kind of connect for a nickel and stay on all day if you were allowed to. So, if you knew where you were going and you happened to live in a dense enough area that had that tech, you're right. Those options were expanding, but. I think there are other reasons other than just the tech that was available that the European kind of prosumer market lasted longer than it did here. It certainly could have happened here. It just didn't.
I think it'd be interesting. Maybe a discussion for another time, but I'd certainly like to come back to this at some point.
Yeah.
I think other than that, I'd like to say thank you everyone for listening. We do get a couple of emails, but one thing that did occur to me earlier, I'd quite like to hear from some of our listeners about the games that got them started. Because they're listening to us now. You've obviously had a love for text adventures. So if you want to get in touch, and Jason will give you all the details because I know he has them off the top of his head.
I do. You should write to us if you want to email us. contact@retroadventurers.com is your way to do that. We are also active on Facebook and Blue Sky. You can message us on the Facebook page. You can send us an IM on Blue Sky as well. And we are the Retro Adventurers. Easy to find on both of those. And yes, would really enjoy sharing stories about your kind of text adventure origins and the ones that have stuck with you as well.
Yeah, no, I'd certainly like to hear about them too. So, well, Jason, thank you very much for joining me. This has been, again, the unusual situation where we have completely differing points of view. But, what would the world be without a little bit of divergence every now and again?
And thank you for being the omniscient narrator at the top of the panel, Dave.
You're more than welcome. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be with you again very soon. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Retro Adventurers, a podcast about classic text adventure games. This episode was edited by Nick Moffat and produced by Jason Compton and Dave Hawkins. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, including Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Podcast Addict. Visit us at retroadventurers.com and follow us on Facebook and Blue Sky. The Retro Adventurers is based on a format originally devised by Ben Collier, Jason Compton, and Dave Hawkins.